Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to share some insights and learnings. Let me just check my sound working sufficiently, hopefully. I'd like to talk to you about a simple cup of tea and taste, and the mechanics of taste, and how taste reflects the practice of discrimination. I'll also talk about discrimination in formulating ethics in trade, and in particular in the world of tea. By way of background, 40 years ago, I trained as a tea taster in London when London still held a weekly tea auction. Tea is most often associated with China and India, but tea has grown in 48 countries, and as an industry, it employs 11 million people. It's official that after water, tea is the world's most popular drink, at least among humans. Factors influencing taste are, as you might expect, tea leaf variety, the elevation and orientation of the land, the soil, and the climate. The many other factors affecting taste are skill in harvesting or plucking the leaf, and the time it takes to transfer the leaf from the field for processing. Then there are the processing stages of withering, rolling, cutting, fermenting, and drying, and finally leaf finish, retained moisture, and storage conditions. At each stage, there is an opportunity to impress the sensitive leaf, and these impressions can often be detected or signaled in the taste. Learning to taste for quality and character is an organoleptic craft requiring the use of more than one physical sense. It is, of course, the mind that interprets the physical signals and characterizes them, assigning to each signal a value and a meaning and a significance, and all within just a sip. Tasting tea as a profession begins with learning to differentiate the basics of leaf type, leaf grade, and origin. Once you can differentiate, you progress to recognizing and understanding particular characteristics, often down to the peculiarities of individual tea gardens, much as it is for the wine taster and particular chateaus. The aim of taste recognition is, of course, to recognize qualities as cause and effect. To usefully compare tasting to discrimination, it is helpful to consider the forces involved in the act of taste. There is the object, the tea, the observer, the mind through the sense organ, and the middle or activating principle, which for taste is the breath. Here is a slide of a cross-section of the sense organ. Perfect timing. The taste buds in the mouth or palate deal only with the basic qualities and with some aspects of differentiation, such as texture. When tasting, the in-breath passes first through and across the form, activating and collecting molecules, which upon the out-breath pass across the olfactory nerves or sense located in the nasal cavity. The olfactory nerves respond to the essence carried to them on the breath, providing the brain with a full spectrum of the most subtle signals necessary to reveal the full range of characteristics. It is worth repeating, if I may, that in the physical act, the air, breath, or middle principle both activates the object and carries an essence of the object from the lower to the higher part of the sense center. For the taster, practice reaches a stage when the essence, the simple aroma of the leaf, is often sufficient to reveal its full story, just as the aesthetic nature of a thought can reveal its source, enabling the observer to assign meaning and significance. We have another slide, the musician, coming up. For tea tasting, discrimination probably ends at discernment, but the process of tasting does offer us clues to the development of higher mental discrimination or abstract thought. Taste for a purpose, so to speak, as any physical craft or interpretive skill, demonstrates the need to unify different forces in order to experience, know them, and apply them. One might suggest that perhaps skill is elevated or recognized as art when the breath, the middle principle, activates both the abstract mind and the instrument or object to achieve that synchronization of inspired performance or perfect movement. The simple craft of tasting demonstrates that the deeper our knowledge and experience of the object, the observer, and the middle principle, the more subtle and aesthetic our understanding can become. This is, of course, more universally demonstrated and recognizable in the physical arts than it is perhaps through taste. But the principle stands that deep experience and knowledge serves to reveal the aesthetic of the nature at the heart of the activated form. We have another slide of some tea. So this is tea growing in the Nilgiri Hills or Blue Mountains of South India. In my own experience, it was not until I had the opportunity to spend time on tea gardens in India that I believe I really understood tea at all, and the peaceful aesthetic joy of tea in its own place. Waking early in the foothills with the aroma of acres of green leaf and observing the mountain mists was a formative experience, certainly for me. On my regular trips, I always felt that I suddenly knew something more about tea just by being in the place and involved in the life of the tea garden, its location, its people, and its simple sense of purpose. So how does talk of tea and discernment hopefully dovetail into ethical trade? So we have another slide. Behind the simple joy of tea, there is a very real human story of inequality to be addressed. I had co-founded a small tea business in the mid-1980s, and we had set out simply to identify and support tea gardens operating without child labour. A couple of years later, we found ourselves helping the embryonic Fairtrade organisation being set up through a cooperation of leading charities, which, having decided to form, was at the stage of working out the ethics of Fairtrade and how principles could and would hopefully work out in practice. Following some energetic debates and a little research for lack of a proven model, a set of ideas was formulated. When the work was done, we used our small tea business to launch the first independently recognised Fairtrade teas. And over the next 25 years or so, there was an opportunity to collaborate and cooperate with a number of tea estates in different countries. Our aim was to attempt to demonstrate to other tea businesses in the industry, and hopefully to the world of tea drinkers, what might be achieved and sustained through cooperation and goodwill. So we have another slide. We have one more slide there. Since that time in the early 1990s, different fair trade approval or validation schemes have emerged, each forming a different approach to answering the same basic questions. What is fair trade? Which system or approach is credible and sustainable? How do you change embedded practice and norms and then sustain a new normal? Essentially, how does change for good happen in this arena? To answer these questions, it may be helpful to symbolize the middle principle as it appears to apply in this particular context. Here's another slide. From the esoteric perspective, fair trade could be represented as a triangle formed of three aspects: the principle of equality, the principle of sharing, and the principle of goodwill. The triangle stands upon trust, and at its heart is the spirit of cooperation. As it is only through trust and cooperation that these principles are successfully expressed and applied. As the formula suggests, the five elements together both form and inform the middle principle or path of approach. We have one more slide to come. Here, I think on tea, yes. With a leap. So this is a slide of some mums and young children on the same tea estate in South India. The practice of discrimination when forming ethics in trade begins with differentiating by industry, country, geography, and culture, plus knowledge of the levels and types of supply and demand. This is followed by a deep investigation, study, and recognition of the particular problems and difficulties for all dependents and stakeholders. The initial aim is to gain an understanding of the current situation and the issues to be addressed, regarding these simply as gaps to be bridged. The test of understanding, or of the group's powers of discrimination, comes once everything has been considered and you find out what happens when you attempt to intervene. Have you identified the right approach? At this point, I should mention some probably inevitable, erroneous preconceptions and assumptions by facilitators. These tended to arise from fixed ideas within the facilitating group, essentially unrecognized prejudice. For example, in some tea-growing communities, creating entirely female groups to decide community investment activities proves to be necessary. This was not the planned equal approach. A different example, I recall one particular community plan to direct funding to the installation of satellite television, when there was perhaps more pressing physical needs to be addressed. Again, off plan. This decision generated much internal political debate. It turned out that the community group who decided the plan wanted to run English television programs in their recreation centre to improve their children's English language skills. This was one group's particular priority at that time. The lesson for facilitators was to recognise that solutions are not the ideas you decide to take into situations, but are what you take away from the experience. Different industries face slightly different challenges. Tea is considered particularly challenging because tea estates often have populations of 3,000 to 5,000 dependents and can be isolated. The estate populations are at risk of organised exploitation, unlike, for example, coffee farmers, who are generally family units and mainly need a fair minimum price and to form strong, representative, democratic cooperatives. Both industries are exposed to the effects of commoditisation in the form of low prices and environmental risk to crops. Tea estates must cope with low prices while also providing the population with shelter, water, access to food, healthcare and education, and so on. The way fair trade planning works out in tea is to begin with the basics of minimum price and access to all essentials, and then to ensure education and representation. From the start, the central formula for working on ethics in tea has been to recognise the often embedded inequalities to be bridged, and then to invest an additional financial premium above the price paid for the tea leaves. It proves to be fundamentally important that the voice of women on plantations directs the use of these social funds. The deeper you engage with tea estate communities, the closer you get to understanding that it is the gaps, for example, in the provision for continuous education, that must be bridged, and that representation for change is almost entirely a matter of guaranteeing female representation and leadership at the heart of decision-making. In practice, empowering women creates strong families and communities. Representative women's groups in tea communities know what they need to raise the conditions for their children, each other, and for the whole community. The next three short slides I've borrowed from an information video, so forgive me, but it's basically something we developed, and with a tea garden we worked with since 1993, and I've used them because I feel the statements accurately portray the confidence arising from a mutual right approach. So the first slide is a tea estate school teacher working in the same tea garden that you've seen pictures of so far. As we move to the next slide, this is a student on the same tea estate. And we have one more slide. and this is Tea supervisor. So successful intervention or right action in the ethics of tea growing is about removing price uncertainty and helping people achieve and sustain what they know they want and need for their families within the community setting. The facilitators and the community groups had to come together to create an environment of trust and goodwill. They had to find that spirit of cooperation that gives form to their shared purpose. It's a good idea. So when learning to use the faculty of discrimination, whether tasting tea or intervening in its industry, it proved not to be enough to stand back and simply to differentiate. You need to get involved if you seek to recognize the understand the causes from their effects. It is, of course, that middle way of right approach that takes you to the heart of the matter and leads to right understanding. The aim of fair trade in tea is complex, but it is essentially also very simple. It is entirely about supporting equality by ensuring access to a complete path through education and female representation. In many countries, the demands for social and corporate responsibility in trade and consumer goods is gaining momentum. Young people in particular are the greatest supporters of ethics of trade, as well as the ethics of environment and the ethics of community. The young, who seem to seek the meaning and significance of everything, are recognizing their wider connections and responsibilities in a new way, in a wider context. And as we often witness, the young are most often principal champions of equality. As esoteric students seeking to work with energies and forces, we seek to use discrimination to perceive the nature at the heart of every thought and form. The purpose of this is to live and act harmlessly and harmoniously, but also effectively by applying that activating, enlightening middle way. We discover that only through synchronizing the mind to the middle principle of universal love can we successfully activate any thought, object, or experience to reveal its true meaning, its truth. In conclusion, just as the breath activates the object in taste and goodwill activates cooperation in social progress, the relative middle principle not only informs but activates right interpretation and right movement. We have a final slide. So, concluding there, thank you everyone for the opportunity to share these thoughts and learnings with you